for the discussion, we have two discussants, Mr. Hyung-min and Mr. Philip Christo. We'll give a brief introduction. Hyung-min is an architectural historian, critic, and curator. He received his PhD from History, Theory, and Criticism program at MIT. He's currently professor at University of Seoul and has been the author of many books, including Portfolio and the Diagram. For the Venice Biennale, he was curator for the Korean Pavilion in 2008 and 2014. And in 2014, the Korean Pavilion was awarded the Golden Lion for Best National Participation. He was the director of the inaugural Seoul Biennale of Architecture and Urbanism, and is the chief curator of the current Cosmopolitan Look exhibition. And Philip Christo has worked with Florian Bagel Architects and the Architectural Research Unit in London since 1985. He studied art history at McGill University, Fine Arts at the University of Lethbridge, and the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, Halifax, and architecture at the Architectural Association. He is the director of Florian Bagel Architects and professor emeritus at the Castle University of Art, Architecture and Design, London Metropolitan University. He has been teaching architectural design with Florian Bagel, co-authoring several books and many essays in international journals and exhibitions. Yes, without wasting any time, would you like to comment or ask questions about the presentations we just had? We should start with Hyung-min.
I should speak? Just a kind of question, I think, a provocation rather than a specific commentary. I already knew that this building was the foundation of the Central Bank of Hungary, and that it had funding from China. Is that correct? Some of the support was from China? No? None at all? Okay. But so I'm looking at this book that I just picked up from the upper floor, and it's a publication from the Central Bank, and it has these global strategies and visions that are presently in the works. And so it has this sort of global scale, geographical, economic visions. So this Eurasia Belt, China, Mongolia, Russia economic corridor, the new Eurasia Bridge economic, and a lot of the major China initiative, the Road and Belt things. And so one thing that struck me with the series of presentations today is the difference of scale. And so the very delicate, beautiful sense of detail that came out from primarily the three presenters from Hungary, and then the larger scale works that were presented by the Koreans. And of course, so I think where does this sort of difference in scale come from? And obviously it's the sense of time and change that is quite different. So I was looking at this larger scale, maybe a larger universe scale issues, but the kind of global scale issues that the banks, central banks of the world, the large multinational corporations are involved, and then the kind of architectural details that are involved. And so I was thinking, the question was, does this sort of different sense of scale that come out from architectural projects, are they directly connected to the different rhythms of time and scale that are now in operation, that have changed in the past decades, that show in this kind of... So in this scale, there is no architecture here. There's no physical detail that is relevant in this kind of thing. Of course, these forces come to to bring out different architectural projects and the way the projects are approached and how they actually come out. But I was trying to think through why this different scales. I think it was not just merely that perhaps there was some communication and the Hungarian counterpart presented mostly these smaller scale projects, and that the Korean architects presented larger scale. I think there is a kind of geographical distribution at this present historical moment of different scales of operations that create different projects. So that is sort of like a kind of hypothesis of how we might talk about these sort of different presentations. No, it's
you made a second provocation.
Well, thank you everybody for coming and for making such an effort. The people that have presented have, I think, really done a lot of work putting together very nice presentations. I can see that a lot of care has been taken on both the Hungarian and the Koreans. In my mind, I would take what you've said in a slightly different way. Yesterday we were supposed to be talking about digital things and so on, but we ended up talking about what we said context. But really, it was what we're talking about today, which is how the collective consciousness of the past and identity is played out in current architecture and in society. That's what we're talking about today, I think. And in my mind, for example, let's say the problem of the single family kind of house that with multiple styles and so on that is out in the landscape that's happening all across the G8 anyway, and definitely across Western Europe, and a kind of sprawl, or undifferentiated, multiple stylistic, everybody doing individually what they want, without any real coordination. In my mind, that phenomenon is related to this big scale capitalistic investment and economy. But in our terms, I think the discussion is about time, how we understand time, and that's what I think what you're asking as well. How so time as in historical time, or how we had I think a very nice introduction on the tour yesterday by the guy who gave us the tour about the history of Hungarian history and how like a lot of the things that are up here around the castle were built in the 19th century as trying to regain a historical identity that never really existed, or did exist but got destroyed, and so there's a sense of trying to have a history, an identifiable history, and so that a lot of that, even a project like this is to consolidate the past in some way, and that's a lot. That makes a lot of sense for that. There's a lot of reasons I can understand why that is the case. It's not only a conservative, reactionary kind of reason for that. It's people need to have a sense of time, of their culture. And it seems to me that we can do a lot as architects with that, understanding the different times in a place and revealing it. And that's what, let's say, a project like this building is. It's identifying some different times in the fabric of the building, and then bringing those together and making them understandable and useful in the current time. You know, with making a big opening there to make a hall open to the what used to be the courtyard. So it's somehow make it useful and contemporary and identifiable with the other times in this place. Yeah. So I think that's what we're really talking about, is how to identify different times.
Actually, to sort of make this comment a very blunt statement, again a provocation. Time sometimes goes very fast in certain periods and regions. So in those times, it is very difficult for architecture to have detail. So you just sort of, and it's very specific. So how much time do you give a certain project? Sometimes it's totally unreasonable, and the kind of buildings that come out, they serve a purpose, but there is none of the details that we want. A lot of China's projects in the recent past decades, I think their rhythm of time has slowed down, and so their architecture shows a lot more detail. But for a time, you know, these buildings would just sort of just happen. They just printed it out, and a lot of that happened with Korea. I think there was a period when Korea, the time was really fast, and we built tons of buildings that had really, you know, very few architectural qualities. I'm not saying that because we have two different types of presentation where the scale of the Korean projects are larger. I think just because of the scale, the presentation, the limitations of 15 minutes, you know. So bluntly speaking, sometimes when the rhythm of time is so fast, the nature of the architect, nature of the building becomes really rough. So and the budget, and you know, really this is very practical sort of issues that could be connected.
I will mention another aspect. Perhaps it has some connection with the time, with the speed of the time. This is actually the role of the architect in society, and I had the impression after your presentations that you are very much involved in programming a building and large-scale programming. And here in Hungary, we are actually not very often allowed to, let's say, program, because we are not in the role of programming the buildings. So we have a limited space, scope of work in that sense, and that's why we are more connected with detailing and thus another connection with the time or with the past. You know, if you are programming, you are on another level. You are putting together, for example, a cinema with a lot of stacked rooms, or this medical center, or the cultural center, and then I'm getting on larger, even larger scales. And then detailing is not so important because you have a limited time. Still, if you work 24 hours in 24 hours, you know, because the building speed is there too, and the pressure from the client. So this is for me a kind of outcome how you are tackling your problems. But perhaps it's false because yesterday there was another scale what you were talking about, or what was presented.
Since I'm the one who would say let's rush, so I will before better culture. No, Hyungmin, I think you try to provoke to polemicize this kind of Korean versus the Hungarian.
No, it's not.
That's small to delicate.
It's not big. I'm not versus. this diagrams has relevance, that there's a connection here going. Yeah. And though we think it's versus, actually we are part of a kind of course. Yeah. So it's not versus.
No, I think it was a kind of range, and I think there was actually like scale-wise also. It has a quite. It wasn't like this.
Right.
And your work also deals with this old museum, was it? Right?
Which one? Castle.
The castle.
Yeah.
But I think there is things, maybe if I had to connect the dot, the time aspect, I think that's, I mean, for my sake, what we were trying to do is actually, our city has so much happened just doing stuff for a while in a very fast period of time, and I think now we're picking up the pieces and somehow construct a new kind of narrative so that it doesn't kind of remain as a sort of a chronology, but some kind of a sense of history or some kind of a collective narrative. And I kind of found other presentation, whether it's a small delicate house that he was doing with the surroundings, and maybe it's a much more minute things, but I think these things kind of works in very different scales than your project and so on. So I found it in that way there is a kind of a common interest and also strategies. I think that whole variation was quite interesting. And I think what you said is also like you kind of become you sort of in a way to become like us, but when you're saying that, I was thinking like we kind of have to become like you in a way, because Seoul, where we're based, Tuji and I, it's like we're shrinking now in a way. And this is a cliche that it's this urban explosion and all that, because it used to be 20 years ago, it was 11 million, that was expansion. Of course, the metropolitan region expansion is another story, but if you focus on that, Seoul has, last 20 years it's shrunk, and thank God we had a couple of economic crises, and now it's about 10 million, and actually I think that's what out of these opportunity opened up, and I think that's what I thought was they're very important things for us to also be a very, like, I can bring some toolkits from here, so that was very important for me.
Just a few words on the diagram. In a wider context, if we look at the history of Hungary in the last 1,000 years, when the first kingdom, or Hungarian kingdom, was founded, all the time our history was some kind of smart strategy to stay alive in between powers like Russia, Turkish, or Western European countries, and this technique is you can look at it in two different ways. Are we looking at enemies in all directions or friends in all directions? And sometimes it feels like if you find a friend on one side, you get an enemy on the other. So this is something this way of thinking, let's see closer to figure out why this happens. Maybe I'm not sure why at the moment and why in the details how it's gonna happen or has to happen. But if we focus on the friendships, then I think every direction is a good direction. Maybe that's something that goes closer. And the other thing is that economic growth that was in my mind. Wherever I saw massive development in cities based on economic growth or some type of extreme changes in the life of a city, it never really results in a good thing. Because if you don't have time, now we are back to time issue. If you don't have enough time to figure out or to test it or to consult, then it is always growing too fast, and that's not good for any capital or any town or any village.
I agree with you that the same question could be asked exactly from Hungarian side to Korea to that. Korea is going through a different period, therefore, I mean, it may be one word. It's coming from both directions. But my question is, time-wise, I think different ways. That I think yesterday we talked about the future, the production and making of architecture in the digital age.
Yeah.
So yesterday we talked about today and tomorrow. Yeah. And today we talked about memory, which is yesterday and today.
Yeah.
So my question actually to, especially the organizers, is that how, I mean, we know if you look at history that the change took place, it influenced one each other. So how the subject of today's the regeneration issue and yesterday's digital age making of architecture, methodology of it, how those two are related. I mean, especially in conference, it's a very interesting topic, both of it. So now my question is that how those two things will be related. That brings all 3 tenths of the time, past, present, and future.
Yeah. In my mind, the well, what I've seen in Korea is only in the last, maybe since Mr. Zhou's project on the island for the changing the, which is in the exhibition, the sewage plant turning into a park. Yeah, what's that? 2005 or something?
That's 20 years ago.
20 years.
It was begun 1999.
Yeah, so that's like a very early kind of regeneration of a existing building into something
post-industrial.
Yeah, isn't it? It's a very, in Korean terms, it's a very.
It was
early,
a post-industrial renovation.
So, and since then, this has become much more. That kind of a project has become much more of a real kind of normal project that people are. It's becoming more and more popular that is happening, isn't it? Reusing buildings and thinking about also just the not demolishing and rebuilding all the time.
And his 당인리.
Yeah, for example.
The last project, the power station.
Yeah. And so I think in the answer to your question that I think that that's also the future. So, you know, of course it's about the past and the present, but it's what we're going to be doing in the next, generation. A lot more is not only thinking about history and all that, but just taking more care with what we've got, and not just saying, just demolish and it's easier to rebuild, but being a little bit more efficient with the materials that we're using, and not being so inefficient with materials of building. And it's more expensive usually to let's say do this renovation of this building rather than just get rid of it and put a steel frame up or something. Of course, you wouldn't be allowed to do that here, but if you were, the developer would say, do it, it's cheaper, so it's more expensive, of course, to do a renovation, and especially a careful renovation like this. But that expense, nobody ever calculates the cultural value as of what you've done here. We can't. It's hard to calculate that.
It's not just, I think, the calculation of cultural value. It's a real practical, I think, way of. We need a new way of calculating what economic value is. And I think, in response to your question, I had a very specific curatorial judgment. And those who have not seen the exhibition, please come by. And in the last section of the exhibition, I wanted to have the new sort of digital technologies that are not directly related to building projects. And so actually, Mr. Zhou, who is the CEO of Spacewalk, and he presented yesterday, and his project is in the last section of the exhibition. And I'm of course very interested in what he is doing, what Urban Base is doing. And so these are sort of like digital sort of technological platforms that are not directly related to building new things. But my sort of like innocent hope, and I'm actually speaking to Mr. Zhou also here, is that these new digital technologies will will bring new ways of evaluating built environment.
Yeah.
And so in the old model, you just sort of follow the real estate economics of land price. But the information systems that are being created, I think, hopefully will bring a kind of new way of understanding what land value is. And so that was why I thought that the sort of intersection of digital technologies could in fact bring a new way of
and I can explain that I can imagine what you're saying in this way. So there's the past and there's the present, and then the future, of course, is going to be a digital, I guess. But I think that one of the very strong ways that the digital technology will help us is in negotiating change. So understanding the dynamics of change, which is. That's basically what you're doing. You're kind of making models for the changing density requirements or something. But those are relatively complex modeling that perhaps can best be done digitally. Yeah, and it's difficult to make those judgments with one's own mind. So I think that's I can imagine a very important part of the digital world will be helping us is in negotiating and understanding the dynamics of change. But the change could be that we're talking about is the change of like this historical fabric into contemporary use or something. Like it's this kind of change of. Or it might not be physical as well, as you say. Like it might be the changing lifestyle, or
I think So there will be different ways that people will judge whether it's sort of a financier or a development company deciding how much I'm going to tear down, how much I'm going to rebuild, how much I'm going to renovate. But the old capitalist methods of that decision, I think, is terribly outdated, inefficient, wasteful. So in the new kind of worldview, I think we need sort of much more different kinds of judgment systems and digital.
I think it's the change, how to do it is a one, and that I think will have substantial implication from digital age from the past. But in urbanism, actually, if you look at it, shopping, for example, it's just a simple thing. Mm-hmm. And Sears Roebuck is selling all the buildings now. And the shopping centers, which is the 20th century, the transportation result, shopping centers are being renovated to something else, trying to reformat it. So I think one is the technique or methodology of it, which we can gain out of digital age. But at the same time, I think my sense is that there's enormous forces coming in terms of larger scale, the contents development itself, that something is changing. And how are we going to, because yesterday we talked about I really thought it's great to have how digital age, we can make architecture. It's more about how to do it. And I think the same thing can be applied probably urbanism too, but I think in urbanism there is a more substantial land shaking things going on than even architecture.
I think yesterday, now we are talking about digital architecture and programming. I think it may sound like a coincidence, but yesterday I noticed that the presentation was also neatly divided into two parts. Some architects were more into using digital tools to very high quality crafting. Some architects like him was more interested in doing programmatic development. So going back to your comment about Korean architects seemingly doing more programming work, I think this might be true, but I think that happens because sometimes even the client do not really know what they're going to do with their building. For example, you think this building is already finished, but they're still looking for people to run the place. I think that happens because in a very fast changing society, I mean, the people with money and means, they want to do some building program, but they really don't understand what they're going to do about it. So that's how architects sort of got involved in this kind of situation, but there is always a very inherent danger in doing that because you are excessively getting involved in the actual business side of the project. I mean, as opposed to architectural, the success of the project. And I think in the end, when we probably, since Min-seok also commented that Korea is now shrinking in terms of economy, in terms of growth rate, in terms of population, then probably there will be a time that we will really like to do more programming, but we can't, because things would come to us more in a fixed way, so that we instead of getting into programming part of the project, we probably end up spending more time on crafting.
Maybe.
Mm-hmm. So my point is that goes to what he's trying to do. Yesterday, he only talked about quantitative aspect of what he's doing, but probably in the long run, if your program becomes so sophisticated, not only just calculating the potential possibilities of quantitative measurement of different scenarios, you can also probably deal with different scenarios in terms of programming as well. So I think that's actually where the digital architecture can also meet the other type of architecture.
I mean, the possibilities of what kind of information comes in is endless. But even in this renovation program, the issue of program would have been very interesting. I think the basement area was not programmed. It was sort of like an open-ended space, was it not?
Well, these rooms too, they're general rooms.
So yes, it's a good question. The main program at the beginning of the design process to let survive the building and build up the attic level and cover 2 courtyards that I mentioned. And I think the definite program of the different rooms was forming during the design process and after the construction period until nowadays. But what is very important changing is the openness of the building, which is unfortunately now not visible. Because before this intervention, right after the period of the historical museum that I mentioned, it was a closed building with scientific research functions. And the main idea was to open the whole ground floor, the whole basement, until the top of the Baroque staircase for the tourists, for the visitors. And only this level, which contains this lectures room and room for representation, and the attic level was closed in these plans. And the construction period was finished 1 year ago, and the restaurant worked only a half year. So this is a problem, but it's not in our responsibility, or how I can express. But but I can see this building that it's very, very strong, and it has a very strong materiality and a very strong atmosphere. And during its history, it had a lot of functions, a lot of unexpected function and natural function as well. So I'm sure that the building will survive, and I think, and it's maybe a comment to the main question between around the time. Are the elements of our interventions, life expectancy, are not so long, than the original historical part, life expectancy. Especially, I have to mention the mechanical installation and this contemporary lighting and so on, which life expectancy, I think 10 years maximum or 20, and then it will be changed totally. But I can imagine, I'm not afraid to imagine that 100 years long, 100 years later, the two courtyards will be opened again. And I think in our mind, it was a very important thing to make a difference between the inevitable value of the building and the freshly or recently added new elements. And we will see what will happen.
So, go ahead. I mean, you hear the church bell. It means that it's 7 o'clock, and yes, throughout the presentations, I found more similarities in philosophy and approach to these projects, and the differences were more pertaining to the material conditions or the working conditions. Like you mentioned, the time differences, the scope of the amount of time you have on a specific project, and also what we have left. I mean, what we have left and the validity and the compatibility of what we have left to contemporary life in terms of density, material, program. I believe it was such very physical and materialistic differences that come to show these outcomes that are quite different in result. But in terms of the spirit of approaching an old building or a historic fabric, there was a lot of similarities between the two countries, I believe. And just to, I mean, the question that Mr. Wu asked, the issue of yesterday's discussions and connection with today's, it could have been a bit alienating for the Hungarian participants who were not here, but I think it's a very important theme, so perhaps sometime later we can have a symposium called Urban Regeneration in the Digital Age. As our relationship between Korea and Hungary proceeds, perhaps we can have that kind of a symposium next time.
Okay.
Yes, because we're having a pechakucha at 8 o'clock, and we need some time to prepare and to have dinner before the show. I think we should close the session, although we have many questions left. Thank you all for your participation, and we look forward to meeting you at the pechakucha. Thank you so much.